Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Neslin. I'm the President and CEO of the Council of Canadian Academies, and I'm pleased to be your moderator this afternoon. Today's panel comes at a very auspicious time, not only for the Canadian Science Policy Conference, but for Canada. In fact, it was just earlier today that the Governor General of Canada gave the speech from the throne, in which she said, "Our Earth is in danger. From a warming Arctic to the increasing devastation of natural disasters, our land and our people need help. We must move talk into action and adapt where we must. We cannot afford to wait." And I said, and CCC, the co-sponsors of today's session, wrote the abstract that was accepted for today. They probably could not have anticipated the Governor General's remarks, speaking so profoundly to the session we're having, in which we identify global climate change as the challenge of our time, requiring changes in individual and collective behavior, and recognizing the role that we all can play. It was also the sponsors' observation that research shows that while Canadians are relatively literate compared to many of their counterparts around the world, and I might say a topic that the Council of Canadian Academies addressed in a report a few years ago, there is still much in the area of misinformation that is lowering acceptance of climate action. Our distinguished panel today will address many of these challenges: how science literacy, how journalism and behavioral sciences can further support or explain the failure to act on climate change. My plan today is to try and stay out of the way and let the panel speak. Let me tell you what our plan is for the next 90 minutes. I'm going to introduce each of the panel members all at once. And I'll let you know up front that one of our panel members, Professor Matthew Nisbet, was unable to come today because he is unwell and unable to participate, and we wish him well. That said, we have four distinguished panel members. I'm going to introduce them all to you at one time. And then I'm going to turn to the first presenter, who is John Cook. John will give his remarks, after which I'll open the floor to a very quick, what I would call clarifying question from the audience, if there is one. And then we'll return to the next speaker, the next, and the next, until we're done with all four speakers. I've given them each about 15 minutes, and they're not going to use slides. You'll hear from them and their views, and I think you'll find it very compelling. Once we finish the formal presentations, there'll be an opportunity for audience Q&A, certainly a good 30 minutes or so. I'd ask you to use the live Q&A button on the website. And if all goes well, we'll be able to see your questions. We'll be able to take them, including those that seem to generate an awful lot of interest, and try to get to them all. If all goes well, the panel will themselves engage in some conversation. And I hope by the end, we'll all feel that we've learned a little bit more what the opportunities and challenges are, and how this very medium that we're using, the web and the technology, will enable conversation, not impede it. And with that, I would simply just close my opening remark by thanking again CSPC for their stellar leadership in Canada, for bringing together under unusual and still challenging circumstances of COVID-19 and the other challenges we face. So I thank them. I thank ISED. I thank ECCC for their work. It wouldn't be a presentation if I didn't also mention that certainly CCA is interested in this topic. We have a number of assessments underway on misinformation, on climate change, disaster resilience, and the circular economy. So please look for those from us. With that, let me turn now to the panel. A brief introduction, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that you'll be hearing from them. First of all is John Cook, Research Fellow, Climate Change Communication Research Hub at Monash University in Australia. John, in 2007, founded Skeptical Science, a website which won the 2011 Australian Museum Eureka Prize for the advancement of climate change knowledge and the 2016 Friend of the Planet Award from the National Center for Science Education. After John will be Marianne Mader, Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Science Centers. Dr. Mader is Executive Director of the association, one of the largest membership-based associations of informal science learning organizations in Canada, collectively reaching more than 8 million citizens per year. She is also co-founder of STEAM Labs, a nonprofit education innovation organization. She's a planet scientist with over 13 years of research and field experience and has studied some of the oldest rocks on Earth in Greenland, collected meteorites in Antarctica, and helped plan and execute simulated lunar and planetary exploration missions. The third speaker is Zhang Zhao, or JZ, as she's asked us to refer to her today for probably my benefit. Associate Professor, Department of Psychology and the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. She is also UBC and Canada Research Chair in Behavioral Sustainability. She was a guest speaker on an Apple podcast titled The Psychology of Interpreting Climate Sciences in Times of Polarization, Distrust, and Disinformation, regularly speaking on this topic. And I know very well that she was involved in Top 26 research and writing, a topic that, and an event I think we all followed with great interest. Her research aims to use psychological principles to design behavioral solutions to address sustainability challenges, such as what cognitive biases people have regarding climate change, how to remove these biases, and how to promote behavior change. And finally, Laura Wesley, Director General of Communications at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Having served as the DG of COVID-19 communications priorities with the Privy Council Office, Laura focused on a whole of government approach to integration in the Government of Canada's communication response to COVID-19. She's also led the PCO's advertising, marketing, and public research, stakeholder engagement, and digital coordination teams. She has a strong interest in applying research techniques such as behavioral science to communications, and recently completed a master's degree in human system intervention from Concordia University. I'm going to stop now with that lengthy introduction. I would also want to apologize to all of you. We've had a few technical glitch is largely from my end. So there may be some echoes or unclear conversation. I hope it's only at my end because I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn the floor over to John, and following John, rejoin you to take a question from the audience before we move on. So thank you very much for your patience. John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Eric. Thanks very much for the invitation to talk too. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to this panel and hearing what my fellow panelists have to say. So my research is focused on really two elements of climate misinformation. So I'm just going to turn my speaker down so there's less of an echo. The first is understanding climate misinformation, and the second is developing solutions to reduce the influence of misinformation, try to neutralize it. And I'm going to talk about both those elements just briefly today. The first thing I wanted to talk about was understanding climate misinformation. And the timing of this panel is pretty good because just last week we published research that we'd been working on for about half a decade into better understanding climate misinformation. And actually, I'm going to post a link to the paper in the discussion forum, so hopefully that will come up for everybody. And what we did with this research was our goal was to train a machine learning model to be able to detect and categorize climate misinformation. Ultimately, our goal is what researchers call the holy grail of fact checking, being able to instantaneously detect and fact check, debunk misinformation online, because misinformation spreads so quickly. We need to be able to fact check it super quickly, ideally instantaneously. So that's what our goal was. And the process we went through was, firstly, we built a taxonomy of all the different types of climate misinformation arguments that you're likely to encounter. And going through this process was quite interesting because we identified 5 main categories of climate misinformation. And I would summarize those categories as being: it's not real, global warming isn't happening; it's not us, humans aren't causing global warming; it's not bad, downplaying the impacts of climate change; the solutions won't work; and attacking either climate science or climate scientists. And the interesting thing about these 5 categories were they were the mirror opposite of the 5 climate beliefs that Ed Maybach has developed in his psychological survey research. The 5 climate beliefs being: it's real, it's us, it's bad, the experts agree, but there's hope. We have the solutions to climate change. Misinformation is about trying to subvert or undermine all of those key aspects of climate change. Now, once we trained our machine to be able to detect these different categories, we then poured 20 years of climate misinformation into our model, scraped from blogs and conservative think tank websites, which are both highly prolific sources of climate misinformation, hundreds of thousands of articles. And that enabled us to construct a 20-year history of misinformation. And immediately the results surprised me. I've been debunking climate misinformation for a decade and a half, and my focus has been on those first 3 categories. It's not real, it's not us, it's not bad. What our results showed us was those were actually the 3 least common forms of climate misinformation. And the most common form of climate misinformation was attacking the science and attacking scientists. So climate misinformation is primarily about undermining public trust in climate science as a avenue to reducing acceptance of climate change and eventually, ultimately reducing support for climate solutions. The other key result from our research was finding that climate misinformation is steadily transitioning from science denial to solutions denial. So the category of the solutions won't work, that has been gradually increasing as a proportion of climate misinformation over the years, over this 2-decade period. And what that tells us is solutions misinformation, or misinformation undermining and casting doubt on solutions and renewable energy and policy to help transition to renewables. That type of misinformation is the future of climate misinformation. That's becoming an increasingly dominant part of the misinformation landscape. So that's a very brief summary of our machine learning research. And it's important to understand the different arguments that we encounter in climate misinformation, because misinformation does damage in a number of different ways. It's not just about causing people to believe wrong things or reducing trust in, or people's belief in inaccurate things. It can also reduce, as I said, reduce people's trust in science, in climate science. Misinformation has a polarizing effect. When misinformation washes over society, people's beliefs about, or attitudes about climate change move in different directions. People who are at the politically conservative end of the spectrum are much more affected by climate misinformation than people at the politically left end of the spectrum. Although I will add the qualifier that this effect is the strongest in the US, and we see it to a lesser degree in other countries. I've mainly focused on Australia and the US, but I think Canada, New Zealand, England, other countries where we have some degree of polarization about climate change. But I think that possibly the most insidious and dangerous aspect of climate misinformation is its ability to cancel out our efforts to communicate accurate information. A number of studies have found that when people are exposed to conflicting pieces of information, for example, facts about climate change and misinformation about climate change, if people don't have the ability to resolve the conflict and distinguish between fact and myth, then what the research finds is people tend to disengage and just believe neither. And this has big consequences for any of us who are in the business of communicating accurate facts to the public, because it means that our efforts to inform the public can be undermined or cancelled out by misinformation. Even if we put all our efforts and do a good job of designing our content well, and it's effective communication, and we get it out to a lot of people, that can still be cancelled out by misinformation. And so we ignore misinformation at our own peril. And if we don't address it, we leave the public vulnerable to being misinformed, and we leave our facts, our efforts to communicate accurate information, vulnerable to being undermined. So that dynamic of misinformation cancelling out accurate information is, as I said, it's kind of discouraging in one way, but on the other hand, it also points us to the solution to misinformation, or at least one powerful solution. If the problem is that people can't resolve the conflict between fact and myth, then the solution is equipping people with the tools to be able to tell the difference between facts and misinformation. And that's what my research is mostly focused on. How do we build public resilience against misinformation? I found a really useful framework for this is inoculation theory. This is a branch of psychological research that takes the idea of vaccination and applies it to knowledge. Just as exposing people to a virus, a weakened form of a virus, builds up their immunity so that they no longer, or they don't get infected when they encounter the actual virus. In the same way, when you expose people to a weakened form of misinformation, that builds up their cognitive immunity so that they're less likely to be misinformed when they encounter misinformation. So what do I mean by a weakened form of misinformation? basically, it involves explaining the techniques used to mislead. And my work is focused on developing or building a framework for understanding the techniques of science denial. Actually, I'll just post a link into the discussion forum for more information about that. And also developing solutions to help people build up their critical thinking and be able to acquire the skills to spot misleading techniques. And one thing that we've done to help with that is develop a critical thinking game called Cranky Uncle, which you can see at crankyuncle.com. The idea here is just teaching people the techniques of science denial and getting them to practice critical thinking, practice spotting misleading techniques of misinformation in a game format. Yeah, but there's been a number of games and tools like this that help build public resilience against misinformation. So I think I might stop there. That were the key points I wanted to touch on, and I'm happy to answer any further questions about this when we get to the Q&A period. Thank you very much.
John, thanks very much. I hope my voice is coming across. I really appreciate you giving that perfectly timed presentation. I will defer, because of some technology problems we seem to be having, the clarifying question from the audience. I already hear some feedback. So I'm just going to suggest that Marianne pick up the baton and go next. And for the audience members, don't worry, we'll have lots and lots of time for questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, John, for that fascinating opening. I'm intrigued. I'm going to have questions, and I can think of lots of great applications for your research. So as Eric mentioned, I'm Marianne Mader. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Science Centers. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about us, and then I'm going to talk about two initiatives that we're doing around climate action and misinformation. So I'm going to kind of bring us out of the research mode into almost, you can think of like models of engagement. So our organization, we have a vision for Canada to have a thriving science and innovation culture of engaged citizens. No big deal, you know, just trying to influence culture in Canada, right? Like, that's hard to do. This is hard stuff. We do it by empowering this network. So as you can imagine from our name, we're a network of organizations who champion science and innovation. So science centers, science museums, outreach organizations, zoos, aquariums, insectariums, maker spaces, all of these places that work within what we call the informal science engagement sector. That's who we're working with. That's who we're facilitating with. And we're supporting them in their work to make science approachable, relevant, and accessible. Those are key pillars of the work that is done by our network. And there's a growing body of research that demonstrates that people with an interest in science have developed science capital. Okay, that's just a terminology that refers to the sum of all the science-related knowledge, attitudes, experiences, and resources that a person's built up over the course of their life. And that's through experiences from school, from informal science engagement, for example, in science centers, but also through family connections, through community connections, through media consumption. This is an ecosystem approach. There's no one-stop solution when we're talking about someone's relationship with science and science engagement. So we really bring this kind of ecosystem approach, I think of like the massive Venn diagram approach, into our work as a network. The other thing I wanted to say about CASC as a network is these organizations, science centers, they're not only beloved. I mean, I'm sure many of you have been to a science center, brought your family there. They are trusted. So in public trust surveys, Canadians rank science centers alongside universities of where you can go for trusted, reliable science information. And arguably, it's a bit more accessible at a science center sometimes than a public kind trying to go direct to a university. So trust, and I know John mentioned that, I think that's a theme we're going to come back to again and again over the course of this conversation. So I'm going to give you a bit of a background about these two broad initiatives that CASC is helping to lead right now. One is focused on youth climate action. So not necessarily specific misinformation, but I think there's some lessons there in our model that certainly apply in this conversation. And the second is Science at First, which is an initiative directly tackling science misinformation, specifically right now, COVID and vaccine misinformation online. So the first one, Gen Action. Okay, very excited. We're at the beginning of this project, so I can say everything because it's just starting. So this is funded through Environment and Climate Change Canada, through the Environmental Damage Fund. The lead organization is actually Discovery Centre, which is the Science Centre out in Halifax. So shout out to the Maritimers in the room. I see you. And CASC is a lead partner in the project that we've called Gen Action. The goal is to engage over 200,000 youth in climate action over the course of about 2.5 years. And we're going to do that. Our role as a network is basically to flow through support and funds to our member organizations to create innovative programs to do that engagement. I wanted to talk about the principles of our model because I think these principles are relevant to this conversation around climate change and misinformation and creating kind of this space to work in. So one is that we have a philosophy of recognizing local expertise and knowledge and empowering organizations who work within that space. So we're not creating a cookie cutter solution to roll out nationally. We're saying, hey, we honor the expertise of these local science centers. You know your audience. You know what engagement mechanism is going to work best there. You kind of create that program. The second part is acknowledging the local context of climate change is obviously different from city to town to province across this country. And so as part of this, every participant organization creates this kind of science spotlight feature that really talks about the local context of how climate change is playing out regionally in their area and highlighting local expertise. So it's the connection to the scientist as well. In the building of our program, we've been very deliberate in not setting up a competitive environment across our organizations. They're not competing for funds against each other. The intent is to empower everyone to do this work. And we are basically mandating that everyone collaborate and share knowledge about their programs as we move through the initiative. And that is very deliberate. So as we move through, people have the opportunity to improve their programs. They have an opportunity to look to their peers for guidance and improvement as they go along as well. And that philosophy is also at the ground level in the youth engagement program. So ultimately, we're kind of getting youth to hopefully commit to an individual, climate action. They're going to do something. But climate action, it's not enough to think individually. We need to think collectively. And so those youth will also be able to see the collective impact across the country of all the actions together, because that data is going to be shared publicly in a graphical kind of representation way. So in relation to this conversation around climate change misinformation, these programs at trusted spaces across the country, creating locally relevant kind of engagement opportunities with youth, are safe spaces to have conversations. When there's questions from family members, they can have those in a non-judgmental way. There are kind of key principles of science communication that are applied in those environments. And you know what? I'm going to segue that over to Science at First, because it's also grounded in good science communication principles. So let's switch hats. So that was a youth climate action focused initiative that's just getting off the ground. And we have Science at First, which is housed within the organization of CASC, but is really co-founded by 3 organizations. So us, the Health Law Institute out of University of Alberta, so Timothy Caulfield's research group, as well as COVID-19 Resources Canada. And we founded this together, even though it's operationally under the umbrella of CASC. This initiative is specifically tackling science misinformation online across social media platforms. It's launched in January, so it's been not even a year, but it feels much longer, I think, like most things with this pandemic. And it's now operationally quite smooth and moving along. Science Up First is it's basically communicating with the public on science and health misinformation. So it's across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. The way it works is we have a collective of independent experts, scientists, researchers, healthcare experts, science communicators, who are part of the team, I guess you could say. When the team is tracking emerging misinformation trends, and we can get that kind of access to that information also from public health authorities and partners, the team is able to work with this coalition of experts to respond and create shareable, relatable content that's shared out on social media platforms. The channel of Science Up First across these channels or platforms also shares existing content that's out there that kind of meets our accessibility standards. We have some pretty strong science communication standards that we adhere to. So that's essentially how it functions. There are, again, some core ingredients, I guess you could say, to the Science Up First model. I've mentioned the coalition of experts is key. So anything that is produced has been co-created and vetted with experts. And that is critical, and the process, we're transparent about that. We use the best practices of science communication principles, and also the best practices in tackling misinformation. And John spoke to quite a few of those, including kind of debunking. You know, debunking does work. There are research studies that speak to that. And I think it's an important piece of the kind of puzzle and how we respond to misinformation. We also use, you know, engaging storytelling. We are empathetic in our responses. The other, well, oh, actually, I did want to highlight, talking about creative aspects. Right now, there's a collaboration with artists across Canada who are creating content that are being shared across the Science Up First platforms. The third ingredient, or I guess pillar of Science Up First, is the idea of partnerships. And I have to say, something that's been quite inspiring that I've seen throughout the pandemic has been this these initiatives that have sprung up to fill gaps. In our case, it was, you know, a communication gap of being able to respond really quickly to misinformation with kind of trusted and accurate information. There have been all kinds of campaigns and initiatives that have sprung up to fill gaps, and everybody has the big goal in mind, you know, the public safety of people across Canada. And in working in this space, it's been extremely collaborative. So, you know, content that we're creating is shared across science centers, for example. These other large campaigns, you may have heard of This Is Our Shot, Faster Together, Vaccine Hunters, who obviously fill the need. We are all working together and promoting each other. There is no competition here. You know, when you think of our Venn diagrams, we certainly overlap in some of our work, but this is really a collective effort. And I can see that same kind of mentality and approach in terms of how we're going to be addressing climate change misinformation. You know, where are the gaps? Where are the initiatives? How are we all working and supporting each other to do that work? Those are kind of like, I was bringing it way back up here in terms of the structural level, because this is the way we're thinking right now. In terms of partnership with Science Up First, we have those kind of organizational partners that are, you know, maybe communications, promotional, and then we have community partners. So Science Up First isn't going to be the place that everyone turns to for information. We have a resource in that we've created this great kind of system to access expertise. There's kind of graphic illustration expertise, science communication. we can be of service to communities that are trying to reach their community members who may be disproportionately affected by COVID, for example. And so we have direct kind of behind the scenes community relationships where we may provide content directly to other organizations where they can use it and work on getting it translated or co-creating content that's appropriate for their organization. So it's, again, it's kind of, there's public facing, there's stuff behind the scenes, but it's all serving that greater need. I will put some links in the discussion area. I think folks can see the links there. I'll just kind of end by saying the work that we're doing across these initiatives, and I guess you could say this is the principle just of science communication. It's not just about transferring knowledge, you know, it's about building competency. And John certainly spoke to that in terms of building competency in tackling misinformation. And we're also building competency in terms of, in our case, climate action, climate solutions. You know, youth can be part of that problem and problem solving as well. Obviously, the collaborative approach is critical to all the work that we're doing, and building these bridges between scientists and the public, and operationally building those bridges. Like, you know, how are we actually communicating on a weekly basis, on a bi-weekly basis, you know, Slack, all of those models, what works? Because people in different work environments, that can be challenging as well. Academia versus government versus not-for-profit. So I'm happy to speak more to any of that, but I'll hand it back to Eric, and I'm excited to listen in to everyone else's comments because I think we're going to have a lot to riff off of. Thank you.
Marianne, thanks very much. I think I've mastered the turn down the mute and put up something else. But thank you very much. And I do want to let everyone know that there's a little green button in, I think, the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if you see that little green button, that's a place where you can put your questions. And we're all very interested in what your questions are. Technology not being terribly friendly for the last few minutes, but we are endeavoring to make it easier for you to ask questions. And fear not, if it's a little hard, keep trying. If there's a little green button for you to try. Thanks again, Marianne. I'm going to turn it over now to Zhang Zhao or JZ to give us her remarks. Over to you.
Thank you, Eric. So I want to talk about three things. First is, how can global stakeholders counter misinformation that perpetuates disbeliefs, skepticism, and inactions on climate change? Second thing I want to talk about is, what are the most effective ways, based on behavior sciences, to communicate climate science to the public? And the last thing I want to talk about is, what are the most effective interventions to encourage collective behavior change to address carbon emissions and climate change? So in terms of countering misinformation on climate change, I think there are a couple of solutions that are well tested in behavior sciences. So the first solution is use inoculation techniques. So that involve use forewarning. If you warn people beforehand that they are about to see this misinformation on climate change, then they are more prepared to kind of refute it or take a grain of salt when they hear that information. There's also the technique of preemptive refutation, which is telling people, this is what we're going to hear, but this information is false. So be careful when you hear that. Just think twice. So these techniques, these are termed inoculation, have been shown to mitigate misinformation on climate change and a variety of other social issues. Other techniques to address misinformation include explaining why climate change occurs, highlighting the scientific consensus on climate change, and use culturally aligned messages and use trusted messengers. So I think that the trusted messenger part is critical here. It turns out that people don't just hear the information, they hear the information with the speaker in mind. If this information comes from a peer that they trust or role model they trust, they're going to believe that information quickly. Whereas the same information can come from somebody who's outside their group, who they don't know well, then they're not going to trust that information or even process that information. So I think using trusted messengers is key to addressing misinformation on climate change. There are other ways to fight misinformation, including identifying reasoning errors. So you can outline, there are some logical errors in this information, this misinformation presented, and we can identify the mistakes or the logical gaps in the misinformation messages. Another way to address misinformation is use an economic focus in narratives that help bridge bipartisan communications and allow basically the historical greenhouse gas polluters and avenue to support the net zero transition. So using the economic argument is also key. So I think these are kind of the general solutions that have been tested in the literature and that have been working well in countering misinformation. So let me turn into how to best communicate climate change to the public. I think the first method is, one is communicate scientific facts, but don't just present scientific facts. Use stories and narratives instead of just pure cold statistics and data. I'm in British Columbia. We just had the worst flooding in history. We're about to have another storm coming this week. These are unprecedented weather events that we're going through. And I think one communication tool is to say these extreme weather events is most likely driven by climate change, that's one. And two is really tell stories about how people are suffering, what are the consequences on people's lives, on the economy, on infrastructure. I think those kind of more narrative-driven communication tools are more effective than simply telling people, this is the stats, these are the data on climate change, and we need to act on that. So I think using narratives and stories are really critical in properly conveying climate science to the public. There's another emerging tool to convey climate change. That is to use kind of a climate story, to portray a climate story as a heroic epics, or kind of a fight that it's worth joining in. So let's say if you take actions to address climate change, you are part of the heroic movement right now. We should move away from these doom and gloom narratives on climate change into more kind of positive, action-oriented narratives to motivate people to act. There's also the development of storytelling. We should promote storytelling on climate change, climate science, for both communicators and climate scientists to convey the facts to the public, as well as motivating people to take actions. So I think these storytelling tools can be used in movies, in films, in music. Basically, I think Hollywood has taken part in that movement for decades now. I think we can use popular media to mobilize actions and awareness in the public. So I think these are the kind of the effective communication tools to address climate change and also address misinformation. So the last part I want to touch on is behavior change, and specifically, how do we, engage or mobilize collective behavior change? This is actually part of the goals of climate communication. When we talk about climate, misinformation, communication, action, but we rarely talk about the goals. What are the goals of communication? I think, there's several. One is to mobilize public actions, get policymakers to act, to change policies, to change practice. 3 is to get business leaders involved and develop more sustainable forms of products and infrastructure. So I think, the question as a behavior scientist, as myself, I'm interested in how to mobilize collective actions on climate change. I think several tools that have emerged in the literature is, first, let's bridge a knowledge gap in what works. I think from my experience, a lot of people want to take actions on climate change. They are concerned, they're worried, especially the younger people. They are anxious and feeling somewhat depressed about climate change. I think we need to give the public a toolbox to act. So this is, I call action box. And you know, this box will tell people, here are the actions that are most effective at addressing climate change, including, for instance, talking to your local politicians, voting, for instance, based on climate platforms, engage in social signaling behaviors, such as sharing information, talking to your peers about climate change, as well as some private actions you can take. For instance, reduce driving, flying, meat consumption, thinking about renewable energy sources, etc. So these are kind of the range of behaviors that are effective at addressing climate change or reducing carbon emissions per se. And I think in conveying that action toolbox, we need to carefully understand the audience we're talking to. Because in any given population, there are no kind of homogeneous groups in a given population. There are distinct segments in a population. So we have to take kind of a social diffusion approach to identify the different segments, from early adopters to early majority, to late majority, and to laggards. Each of these groups have very different motivations, they have different beliefs, they have different ideas of what climate change is and what they need to do. So I think tailoring our messaging and intervention to each specific group is really important. And I'm going to put in a discussion forum here 2 recent articles we published on, one is on SDG action, where we propose a social diffusion approach, where we target change agents, the trendsetters, and mobilize the early majority, get them on board, try to reach the social tipping point in a given population. And lastly, how to get the laggards and the majority on board. So these are kind of our recipe for collective behavior change. So I'm going to end there. I'll put the links in the discussion forum right now.
Izzy, thanks very much. Some good news here from the control room. First of all, I think I figured out how to turn off the echo. Second good news is there are now people who have asked a couple of questions in the live Q&A. So there are a couple there that we've taken notice of. And as you heard from Jay-Z and a couple of the other speakers, they've deposited some links into the discussion forum. So if you are facile enough with being able to move your way around the website and go to the different spots, you will see the resources, and you will be able to add, excuse me, a couple of questions. And believe me, lots of time for questions, and we've all been being very polite. I told the panelists in advance that if they stuck to time, then they would have more time at the end to add to things that they wish they could have said. So there's more than what you just heard. And I also should note that just because John Cook went first, we haven't forgotten him. So he's going to get a couple of the first questions. So last speaker is Laura Wesley. And Laura, if you'd like to come on, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much.
Eric, and thanks so much to the speakers who have gone ahead of me. It was a really fantastic opportunity to meet you a couple of weeks ago, and we did have quite a vigorous conversation. I'm excited about the Q&A, as you just mentioned. But I'm relatively new to this conversation, to be honest. I only joined Environment and Climate Change Canada as Director General of Communications in June. And to be honest, I haven't worried as much about mis and disinformation in my current role, which is to communicate the government's actions, climate actions, to Canadians. I'll tell you why in a minute, but first I want to share some learnings from communicating COVID. I was extremely concerned about mis and disinformation last year when I worked on COVID communications, and I'll just clarify, in my mind, misinformation, like retweeting something that you didn't do your verifications on, like John was saying earlier, whereas disinformation is really these nefarious actors working to kind of cause confusion in society and uproot public trust. So when it comes to communicating COVID, there were and there still are nefarious actors promulgating erroneous information to intentionally create chaos rooted in fear. And we saw that really clearly. Storylines were targeted to specific populations, often with a kernel of truth embedded or rooted in cultural beliefs. So it's really hard to parse that apart and untangle what is true and what is not true. The impact and spread of mis and disinformation did result in lower than required vaccination rates, which is prolonging the pandemic. Those are my beliefs, and they are based in research and evidence that I saw working on that file. So if the risks and impacts of mis and disinformation were so clear in that context, why am I so much less worried about it now in the context of climate action and my current role? Well, first of all, I'm kind of questioning whether lack of clear information is the or a primary barrier to people adopting carbon neutral lifestyles. Even people who have information don't necessarily act. Most of us still use single-use plastic, we throw away food sometimes, and we still buy more than we need. So with climate change, yes, people are really confused about what actions to take, but why might that be? Is misinformation exacerbating that confusion? Fellow panelists would probably argue yes, and I would not disagree with that. However, I also wonder, what are other potential causes of inaction? Is it because it's too complicated? Are there competing motivations? Is it even possible for people to live in today's world completely cutting out carbon emissions? A lot of choices are not really that clear cut. I'm standing in the grocery aisle and I'm trying to decide between locally produced sausages packaged in plastic and US produced sausages in biodegradable packaging. Which one had less impact on the environment? Obviously, a better choice would be not to eat meat at all, but not everybody is willing to make that trade-off. Why? Is it lack of information? With all this complexity, it's really easy for people to feel overwhelmed, despair, and we end altogether. So then another thing that kind of sticks in my mind is the paradox of this individual action never really being enough to reduce emissions to the point where it would limit global warming. And then conversely, we can't get to net zero without massive behavior change. So what are we communicating there? Like, your actions are never going to make a whole lot of difference, but you still need to make massive changes to your lifestyle if we want the earth and therefore ourselves to survive. Like, how do we actually tell that story? So I do worry about disinformation from a democratic standpoint, and I think other panelists have spoken about that, and also from the view of a cohesive, safe, and healthy society. But I learned a lot working on COVID communications that I'm applying in this new role. I think COVID showed us that we are resilient, adaptable, and able to change. We're able to change fast. We're able to change at scale. Most of us wear our masks in the grocery store or in anytime we're inside buildings now. And we might even feel weird if we're in a public place without a mask. 3 years ago, you would ask somebody, can you imagine yourself wearing a mask all around town? And they'd be like, no way, like I can't imagine a situation where that would ever be the case. So we are capable of a massive change. And COVID showed me as well that examples of what might work to create massive changes in behavior in really short timescales. And that's exactly what's required right now to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. So communicating about COVID increased our awareness, ability, and knowledge of what to do to create and sustain behavior change. And I will say we've used a lot of what Dr. Zhao just spoke about with behavioral science and applied behavioral science to communications. With COVID, we had a health imperative to ensure as many people as possible were vaccinated. So we used behavioral science to understand the link between attitudes and beliefs and how those attitudes and beliefs affected individual adoption of public health measures like masking and social distancing. And that analysis helped us develop different messages and different messengers depending on what worked best for which audience. So, who does the communicating matters. And there were some messages best delivered by scientists. As Marianne said, scientists are actually one of the most trusted deliverers of this type of messaging in Canada. Others are more appropriate for politicians. Others are best delivered by official sources or other experts, such as the chief public health officer. So I wonder, do we need a chief science officer? Do we need a chief environmental officer? Is there a role to play for a different lane there for certain segments of society? COVID also showed me that science literacy is higher than many of us, at least in the communications field, had given the public credit for. As a behavioral scientist said on a CBC podcast during COVID, I was listening to this interview, and I remember her saying, it's hard to prove a null hypothesis. Yet Dr. Tam's modeling updates turned out to be one very effective way of showing the potential outcomes of inaction. So the pandemic also showed me that Canadians have a higher level of data and science interest, and a more tolerance also for, you know, a nuanced and sort of ever-changing or continuously evolving message. And I think, at least I had doubted that in the past. I think there was this idea that we need to have all our facts straight and get them out only once. And certainly that's more ideal. But we saw this ability for the public to follow along an evolving narrative. Another thing I learned is that it's really incumbent on communicators to make science relevant to the everyday lives of our audiences. We need to move beyond the rational into the emotional. We need to connect with people's values, priorities, and their identities. The pandemic, speaking of priorities, pandemic has really shifted many people's priorities and what they value, including nature, family, and being at home, which are all entry points into communicating climate action. So I'm taking a lot of inspiration from those learnings. I'm not questioning whether mis and disinformation exist or whether it's affecting the well-being of Canadians. I'm more questioning the notion that facts alone change minds and behaviors. That's not really my understanding of how humans make decisions. My understanding is that behaviors are often a function of habit, ease, and largely unconscious attempts at meeting, you know, often invisible needs. So I just don't think we've exhausted all the possibilities of what we can do, especially when we apply science itself to communications. We can test which framing and narrative are most likely to lead to the desired behavioral outcomes. And finally, the last reason why I worry less about mis and disinformation in this role than I did in communicating COVID is that my role is to communicate the government's climate actions. So I'm in a bit of a different theory of change, and maybe I'll post in the discussion forum after a link to a really interesting theory of change. Pardon? Okay, I'll keep going. I thought Eric was telling me my time was up and I needed to stop talking, which is probably true, but I'm almost done. So, you know, the question really on my mind is, rather than trying to convince people to change their individual behavior, how might we make it relevant and easy for them to do so? For example, rather than trying to convince people to stop using plastic straws, governments can regulate plastic straws out of the market. Rather than trying to convince people to buy an electric vehicle, governments can regulate the auto industry so that 100% of car sales are electric vehicles. Rather than trying to convince businesses to innovate money to be made, we can tax undesirable business models to change the market signal sooner than the free market would do. So governments can incentivize innovation and then support them to retool factories or retool business models and find new supply chains that are carbon neutral. That's a lot that businesses, governments, media, lobbyists, entrepreneurs, friends, parents, teachers can do to make it easier for people to make low carbon choices. And there's so much we can do as science communicators to support behavior change beyond just giving people the facts. So I think too often we're taking it for granted that if we give people the information, they'll act on it. My question that I leave you with today is, how might we make it easier for people to live in a way that's more aligned to nature and what the earth needs from us right now? Thank you.
Rick, you're live.
I think Eric is getting set up, but I had some indication that I can go ahead and start answering a question that came in the chat box. So I think I'll do that. Although Laura, I have a lot of comments, well, based on what everyone said, but there's so much to unpack. But let's honor the audience, and I'll turn to their question first. I think the first question that popped up might have been when I was chatting about some of the initiatives I mentioned. And I'll just read it. It said, I'm excited about the idea that you're mandating the sharing of data and information for your initiatives. That was a strong word, wasn't it? We are. Could you tell me more about that? Do you have any explicit policy or platform where all this great data will be? And this is from Monica. So thanks, Monica, for the question. So 2 parts. We have some information that is in a kind of member-only area zone. We create a community practice where people can share documents and information. We have Zoom calls. That's where we kind of have that set up already for our network. So it's a familiar thing, monthly Zoom calls. So there's that kind of sharing. But the collected data, I guess, as a result of the participants, that youth data, will actually share the collective data in a searchable way on basically on a website, and that's yet to be created. But we're going to have a pretty robust data management system that allows that data to be queried by geography and seeing trends. I'm really curious to dig into some of the research that was discussed by the other panelists, particularly around kind of these action boxes, public toolbox. Ying, I think that was your research, and how this could apply when we're creating our science spotlights. The science centers are creating that in terms of applying the research in what they're going to do in relation to their climate action. So I'm excited to apply the research into the model as well. But that was it for about how we're going to share information. I think there's a good question, though, that came after that, maybe for everybody, around measuring impact. I think that's what came up next. I'm happy to let others jump in. I can chat about my initiatives, but yeah, for sure, John. How do we know things are working? How do we measure impact?
Sure. Well, I can just give you one specific example, and obviously there's lots of different ways to do this, and the impact will depend on what is your intervention and what are you trying to achieve. With our critical thinking game, our goal is to build resilience against misinformation, and so the game is really based on this notion. I was quite inspired by Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in this book, he talks about these 2 ways of thinking. Fast thinking is almost the vast majority of our thinking is fast, instantaneous reactions, mental shortcuts, emotional reactions. It's very fast, it's effortless, it happens without us even realizing it. And then we have slow thinking, which is reasoning through difficult problems, doing a 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication, or trying to identify the fallacy in some misinformation. And slow thinking doesn't come easily. Critical thinking is hard. But Kahneman also talks about a 3rd type of thinking, expert heuristics, which is basically when slow thinking tasks, difficult tasks, you practice them so often that they become quick thinking. They become this effortless reaction, like a heart surgeon who's done so many operations that they can assess a really complicated situation and instantly know what to do. The goal of our critical thinking game is to take critical thinking, a slow thinking, difficult task, and get them practicing to the point where it becomes quick and easy, and they can much more easily and quickly spot misinformation in the wild. So there's 2 ways that we test this and test the impact of the game. The clunky traditional research way is at the start of the game, players are asked if they want to voluntarily participate in research, and if they agree, then they fill out a quiz where they're shown examples of misinformation to assess whether they are able to spot different techniques of misinformation. And then at the end of the game, they repeat the quiz. So through that, we're able to measure whether there's an increase in critical thinking performance. The other thing we're working on now is actually measuring in the game. As people practice looking at examples of misinformation and identifying the technique, we can measure how long it takes them to do it and how accurate they are. So our hope is that through the course of the game, you will see the speed with which people are able to identify misinformation techniques gets quicker, the time taken goes down, as well as the accuracy goes up. So that's when you're doing a digital game, there's lots of ability to collect quantitative data like that. Obviously, in other interventions, it can be more complicated collecting and measuring impact.
So it's possible that I may be back. And if it is, I apologize for the delay. I know you've already had a bit of a discussion, and I am being heard. I do want to press on a little bit with a couple more questions that we've had both in the chat and in the notes that we've taken so far. I've already offered all of my panel members a free beer. So anyone else who wishes to see this presentation done in person, come to the CCA and I'll buy everybody a beer. I do want to go back to sort of an interaction that I think makes a bit of sense. You've already heard, the audience has heard, and I think you've each heard from each other, that there are actually different methodologic approaches to solving both the same problem and different problems. We've heard communications theory, we've heard behavioral economics, we've heard public health approaches. And what fascinates me is that they all sound absolutely plausible. You know, when John finished speaking, talking about inoculation theory, I thought, yep, that's a good thought. That really makes a lot of sense. John finished, and then Marianne came on and said, you know, we should talk about, and this is not an instead of or one is right and one is wrong, but I wonder if you'd each reflect a little bit on what we might want to call a kind of translational problem across disciplines, because clearly there is no one best approach. If there was, we wouldn't be having a panel. We would have figured it out, we would have moved on and solved other problems. But we're still being bedeviled by some basic, how do we communicate something? Why do we communicate? Questions that Laura raised. So I'm going to ask John maybe to reflect a little bit on what some of the advantages and disadvantages are that he sees from some of his approaches, but also what he sees as the kind of reaching across disciplines that I think we heard a lot of today. And then I'll ask a couple of others of you to jump in. John, would you mind starting off?
Sure. So I think interdisciplinarity is essential to solving complex interconnected problems like misinformation. And the way I've approached this problem has been very goal-oriented, like I want to achieve this thing. And I found you have to work with other disciplines in order to achieve those goals. To detect misinformation, I, as someone with a background in cognitive psychology, have had to work with political scientists doing machine learning research in order to automatically detect misinformation. In order to identify the reasoning fallacies in misinformation, I've had to work with critical thinking philosophers. To do this game, we've had to work with app developers. So all of these different disciplines speak different languages, and the challenge is, like, I've often had consecutive meetings, one with the philosophers, and I'm struggling to keep up with all this vocabulary and even way of thinking that they have, which is completely different to my discipline. Then you go into an app development meeting and they're just spouting all their techno babble, and I'm trying to keep up with that. Working across disciplines is very challenging, but it's also incredibly rewarding and essential, I think. And just one last thing, when I'm now in the process of trying to bring the machine learning people, the critical thinkers, and myself all together to kind of synthesize all that research in an even more interdisciplinary project. And it's amusing to see the machine learning people grappling with all the critical thinking vocabulary. I've been in that hot bath for a while now, and I'm used to it. And I'm remembering, oh, that's right. That's what it was like for me when I started doing that. So yeah, the interdisciplinarity, I think, is crucial.
Great observation. Marianne, what about you?
I was just thinking about, there's this tremendous research knowledge, theoretical knowledge, and how do we get that to be applied on the ground? I mean, I support a network that's on the ground, that that face-to-face in science centers and outreach doing that community, and it's my mind was going, part of it is professional development, linking that knowledge to the ultimate providers and finding the space to do that. I would argue we also have a structural problem in Canada in the support of that kind of translational knowledge from the research land into the practical science and communication landscape. We don't have clear funding models around science communication in Canada. It's not built into our research ecosystem in a way that it is in other countries. So, and I think we see that reflected in kind of the design of the initiatives that we're able to produce. So that's a little bit of my soapbox. But yeah, can we build a greater connectivity? I would love all of you to come to our conference and present your work. How can we apply it in the real world? If you want that data for research, we will be your research partners. We can get you data. But I think we need more opportunities like that. So that is an open invitation to all of you. Please come to our annual conference to present.
That brings up a question that came up either in the discussion forum or the live chat, I forget which was about getting access to this material itself. It's almost ironic. We put things on a website, there's some links, and yet some people don't have access. They are not university professors. They can't walk into a library. They may not have a laptop. CCA just published a report on how difficult it is to get online in rural and remote communities. So how do we have this conversation in public when all the experts are sophisticated, having their conversation in their communities? So there's interdisciplinarity, but there's also expert public. Maybe JZ, you can jump in on that.
Well, I make all my research public. That's my goal. If you cannot access my work, email me. I'll send a copy to you right away. I think all researchers should do that. My research is publicly funded. We should make our work publicly accessible. So that's just my principle. But in terms of interdisciplinarity, so I'm a cognitive scientist, very much like John. And I've had to work with, climate scientists, engineers from a lot of disciplines to figure out basic facts about climate change. I'm learning to do carbon calculations. How do you even do carbon accounting, taking a life cycle analysis to figure out, oh, I have an iPhone, what's the carbon footprint of my phone, of my computer, of the food I eat? So I'm learning that. That's nothing I was trained in, but I think, just figuring out the scientific facts is really refreshing for me. The second, challenge I face is, communicate that to people. So I focus on behavior change, and, I should know what drives people. And climate change is probably one of the hardest puzzles I've ever worked on. And I think, facts, as many of you have said, facts are not sufficient. They're necessary for behavior change. And I think there are so many nuances in the facts, right? So for instance, we all know that beef and land is not great because they are very carbon intensive. But turns out chocolate and coffee is also carbon intensive. Turns out some chocolate has a higher carbon footprint than beef, really depending on how it was grown. So I think teasing out those nuances and really convey the accurate information to the public is already challenging, right? So what is the facts? What do people need to know? And second is how to convey it so that they are receptive, they understand it, and they can act upon it. So there are kind of layers of challenges that we as behavior scientists face, and working with researchers with other disciplines is definitely key to that.
So thanks, JZ. I want to pivot a little bit and maybe turn over to Laura, because she mentioned at the beginning that she spent a lot of her time in a different area of work before switching over to ECCC, deeply intensive discussion about COVID and like. You alluded to this in your 15 minutes, but I'm going to give you another minute or so to maybe explore a bit. What are some of the parallels, and what are some of the, non-specific differences between the kind of communicating that you found in the policy arena for COVID and the kind of communication that has to occur in misinformation generally? What cross-disciplinary political silos do you have to navigate? We've heard about interdisciplinary from a methodologic perspective, but how about multi-disciplines, the policy world versus the political world versus the research world? Can you maybe reflect a bit on that?
Right. Well, John was talking about how polarizing this climate is, and how, I think he spoke to the research on, that notion of people kind of believing what they already believe, or that, the bias, the confirmation bias that exists. So I think that is true to some extent. I don't see it as polarizing in Canada as it is in the US, for example. I definitely see that with COVID, it became very politicized. I would say things are changing on the climate file, as we just had an election here in Canada in 2021, and all the parties had a climate plan. So I think that might have been the first time in the history of elections in Canada that all parties were on board with climate change. They were fully acknowledging that it exists and that more needed to be done to combat it. And I think something like what's happening in BC right now really brings it home to us. We're seeing not necessarily direct attribution of climate change to this one single weather event, but we are expecting to see more and more extreme weather as climate changes. And I was even seeing on Instagram, on CBC's account, that they were talking about more extreme weather, and that we might actually start to have climate migrants in Canada. So I think it's drawing the importance of climate action more acutely. And something that I find challenging is more about the temporal distance between climate. It was something that was always talked about as being so far in the future, and it's hard to bring it into the present and say, okay, this is the impact that it's having right now. People in BC know that. People in the north have known that for a while. People along coastal regions have started seeing that more and more. And a lot of people can remember in their lifetimes how weather has changed. We were chatting about that the other day, that when I was a kid at Halloween, we were wearing our winter coats. And people who were sending their kids out for trick-or-treating this year were like, they were just wearing their costumes and they weren't kind of bundling them up over winter coats. And so we were even reflecting within our own lifetimes. But I think that temporal disconnect is something that is really challenging in communicating climate change in a way that communicating COVID wasn't, because COVID was happening right this minute, and it was the effects could be seen all around us. But I think that's somewhat different depending on where you live right now when it comes to climate change.
Thanks. I want to move a little bit parallel to this. You've all come to this session with deep knowledge and background, and I think with a commitment that is both laudable and heroic, quite frankly, the work that you're all doing. And yet we all want to know, what would success look like? What would impact look like? How do you measure, or at least assess, the work of the initiatives that you've undertaken? This comes from a question from our live chat, but each of you are working in different domains. They're overlapping. And I may want to start with you, John, just to sort of think out loud with us about what's the impact of the work that you're doing? What would it look like if you said, this has been successful? And I don't mean personal success, which is important. I just mean the kind of tip of the iceberg that you've been trying to chisel off the last several years. What would that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So firstly, I recognized a while back that solving the issue of climate change is a really big problem, and too much for a single person to take on. So I picked a very narrow sliver, which was the issue of climate misinformation. And so for me, success on that one issue is removing one roadblock to climate action. And in terms of what does success in removing that roadblock mean, I mean, the moonshot goal would be, following the inoculation analogy, eradicating science denial. In other words, enough of the population became inoculated, became resilient against misinformation, that we essentially achieve herd immunity, so that when misinformation tries to get out there, it withers on the vine. It just doesn't spread. That is probably a little bit impossible, a bit too lofty a goal. But I think the more realistic goal is science denial and misinformation becoming politically irrelevant. So in other words, it becomes marginalized enough that it doesn't affect policy. So I guess that would be success from my point of view.
So I wasn't planning this setup, but I want to go to Jay-Z now. She's just come back from COP26 work, where the world of the political and policy crash together on a regular basis. Just the same question in general to you. What would success in that environment look like? And how would impact even be assessed? And I don't mean at the next, COP27 and 28, 29. I just mean generally. We're talking about translating science into action here. What would that look like?
I mean, the ultimate success for me is reaching net zero in 10 to 20 years. I think we've seen the targets, various targets set by different nations from COP26. That was great, but there was very little accountability for nations, right? There's nothing to hold them accountable for that. So I think, if we can see steady reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the next couple of years, that is a win. And I mean, I'm aiming for net zero, but that would involve significant policy change, significant infrastructure change, collective behavior change. Basically everything we do as of now has to change. So the road to net zero is very difficult, but I would like to believe we can make it there. It's a matter of holding governments accountable, it's one, and getting the public on board.
It's as if we planned this. Marianne, I'm teeing you up next, because we've gone from a goal of sort of mass inoculation, which is a delightful goal, herd immunity. Jay-Z's talked about a goal regarding climate. So these are different kinds of goals. One is about lowering all of the barriers and making it easy for people to see the truth. And you spend a lot of time with the public, or publics, the plural. And I'm not asking you to speak for them directly, but maybe indirectly, could you say something about what they would think success looks like, or what the impact of this great work is?
I have to say, the two initiatives I mentioned, though, the ultimate goal is totally aligned with exactly what John and Jay-Z said. So that Gen Action 1, the goal is net zero. That where this is an intervention. Right now, Science at First being focused on COVID misinformation, vaccine information. The goal is getting Canadians vaccinated. Reaching that over 90%. Like, those are the public interest goals. Whether the public's thinking about that, I don't know. I don't know if the public, thinks about the larger impact goals. They're not thinking at that scale. In our sector, primarily engages families. It is multi-generational. Primary core audience, I would say youth. That K through 12 age youth. When I think about what success would look like to me, for that public, it is the creation of those very relevant, accessible kind of programs that are engaging, based on evidence-based. The research that is shared here that is going into the design of our programs. They'll be more impactful as a result of that. I have to say, as an organization, if I'm representing a sector, I think there's some other strategic areas of success, and I think there's structural changes in how we fund this work. Like I mentioned before, why don't we have collaborative grants for our science outreach organizations and our scientists getting together and doing this work? It's doesn't really have a clear home places. We kind of have this patchwork approach to that work. It's not quite built in the same way it is in other countries with NSF in the States or something like that. So there's a lot of goals.
Right.
Measures of success, many.
And easy to set goals. Always nice to do. 2-year plan, 5-year plan, 10-year plan. Jay-Z talks about 10, 20 years. I don't want to leave the last word to you, Laura. I want to leave the second to last word so you don't feel that you're summing up everything. But just again, taking back your history, PCO and elsewhere, where the reality is probably not 20 years from now, it's next Thursday, where the goal is how do we get done for what is happening in the mandate letters that are going to come out in a day or two in our cabinet, or what's going to happen before the next election. And this isn't a cynical view. This is just, there's the realpolitik of getting some stuff done today. What are some of the early steps? Mariana had talked about Science Up First, and it talked about other possible mandating of certain things happening. But what do you think the appetite is for seeing some real successes soon versus progress towards nice things later in the future? And again, I'm not asking you to talk about the public's attitude or public opinion polling or parliament, but how does the inside of Ottawa think about these kinds of lofty goals? Net zero is a big deal, and it's going to be 2030, 2050, 2090, whatever we move the goalposts. How do you think about that from a political perspective?
Well, as you know, I'm a public servant, so I'm a nonpartisan provider of advice. So I care less about the sort of political side of things, but definitely the public opinion is that we need to do more and faster. That's a line that I'm sure you've heard a lot. And I think a lot of people believe in that. And that's probably at the heart of it, why I worry less about disinformation and misinformation, because there just is so much will amongst Canadians to move this yardstick forward. And I think that's the crashing point, that disruption point or transformational point is going to happen in the today. It's not going to happen in the 50 years from now. If we're net zero by 2050, it will be because we did something different today.
It's a great point. We have about a minute and a half to go, despite the whirlwind of this session. And I want to just maybe take a minute, despite our wish to go on longer, because you had a few questions that we haven't gotten to, but I think indirectly have, to thank the panel members, to thank CSPC, to thank you for your patience with my technical glitches, but you handled it like pros. I don't have any dramatic last minute statements to make, except that I think what you have done as a panel is, I hope, lived up to the expectation of ISET and ECCC in having this conversation at CSPC about the way that science can inform this conversation. And it wasn't just one answer. It wasn't just give us some more evidence. It wasn't just about publish another paper. It was about ways of thinking from the bottom up and the top down. It was thinking about impediments. It was thinking about different audiences and different methods. And although I started my remarks by quoting Mary Simon from the throne speech, I must say that Laura's last comment really resonates. This now seems more urgent than ever before, and a consistent call for urgent action, not just we really mean it more this time. And there seems to be a momentum. I really wish that we could continue this beyond today. For those who are on the chats, we hope you got something out of it, and you'll be able to follow up with each of our panel members. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for your participation and presentations today, and thank all of those who logged on. Thanks very much, and goodbye.